man with perhaps the longest title known at the Australian Centre for Student Equity and Success, and Professor Jessica Vanderlelie from Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic at Deakin. Chris, welcome. We're only just underway and we're about to get into the conversation. Now, retention's been an issue in Australian universities for years, but as international student flows have been constricted and the Accord has elevated our expectations of getting 1 million extra students into the tertiary system by 2050, retention has become an elevated priority. What are we going to do about it? Now, Chris Moran, you have had a lot of comments and insights about what's going on with, particularly with rural universities and the challenges of a two-track system. How is retention faring for you?
Thanks, Tim, and my apologies being a couple of minutes late. It's never good to schedule something immediately after a weekly executive meeting when we just had census on loads. We had a few things to talk about. For us, I guess there are a couple of components, if I could, by way of introduction. Retention, attrition are indicators of performance, but I think it's really important to keep in mind that we want people to succeed at university, irrespective of the way they enter our system. It's kind of in the hearts, hopefully, of our institutions, to care for people in such a manner as that they complete and make their aspirations real. So my first point is for us all to be careful of a statistic as opposed to humans. The second one is that we have load loss attrition, and we have human loss attrition. And dealing with these two things is like fundamentally very, very different. If people are falling out of the system, falling out of the university or exiting, as opposed to they have aspirations to complete something in a certain amount of time and they can't meet those aspirations for what we call life load, that the load of life is pulling them away. So what we find, to come to your question, is that we have two very distinct cohorts. We have a young cohort who come to live here. They come from rural areas in the main. There is the odd metropolitan young person that finds their way into the bush and finds their way here, and they have a rather more conventional track. They work and live here, then they go off and work and earn money, generally regionally as well, and they come back and do it again, and they have a couple of years in college, and then they move generally into town, into houses and whatnot with friends. So that group of people, because they're close to us and they're young, their retention tends to be very high. We tend to lose relatively few of them for whatever set of reasons of being place-based. Then we have a cohort, which is by far the largest cohort within our university and has been for many years, who live lives. They have that heavy life load, and therefore they're hanging on to as many units as they can in their life load. And it's quite difficult for us. We put all kinds of support structures, all kinds of monitoring around that. But we do find that in the end, life pulls them away. And that's the main thing that we get back. We get far more life load explanations than "I didn't enjoy the course" or the lecturer, or those other reasons where people might go. And then we have a third cohort, and a very interesting one. They tend to be in and around the humanities, who are 1 or 2 units from completing a degree, but they found the thing in life that they're wanting to do, or they're happy out there. And no matter how much we entreat them, how much we try to facilitate the completion of a final unit, they simply don't want to do it. And they tell us, "Please leave us alone." We say, "Well, like 1 unit, you can finish 1 unit, so you can take away that qualification." And they simply don't want to do it. And there's quite a few of them. And so that, for us, I guess we manage each of those different groups in very different ways from the point of view of structural support.
That's a hefty debt they get stuck with.
What were you saying, Stephen? What about the debt that they get stuck with?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hefty debt they get stuck with.
Well,
Yes,
absolutely.
I guess their trade, Stephen, is pretty simple. Whatever it is that they were wanting to do in life to support the HEX, because they've already accumulated the majority of the HEX, they've got it anyway, and the completion is more of a sense of for I don't speak for myself, but for many people, that sense of having completed the thing you started. Whereas a reasonable group of people are saying that's not of concern to them, even they still carry the debt. Yeah.
Tim, I don't want to stick my bib in too early too much, but could I expand that question to the panel? I mean, one a decade ago, the Conservatives in power made a big thing about attrition, and they hammered universities like UNE and Southern Cross pretty unreasonably, with no grasp of the nature of their cohorts. But just for everybody across the board, everyone makes a point of telling everybody that, if you're going to drop out before census date. But more broadly than that, is there a challenge to try and reduce people who basically shouldn't because they're not going to finish? I don't mean in terms of academic ability, just in terms of their life experience.
I'll chime in here. I don't know if anyone has seen Andrew Harvey and colleagues' recent paper. This was a couple of months ago now, but they looked at this cohort of students, the leave of absence cohort. And Australia is really far behind in acknowledging this cohort. I think in thinking about how we can support them and tracking them. I mean, they compared it to the UK, where in HESA, there's statistics around students taking a leave of absence and how many come back. But I think the estimate, and I could be wrong here, and maybe Andrew Norton knows, was about 1 million people across Australia have almost finished degrees. So what can we be doing, especially, in the context of the Accord and wanting to raise the rates of bringing these students back in?
1 million.
A
That's a
million.
lot of people.
This is from all time,
Yeah.
over the decades. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think one of the pieces that many institutions have looked at is nested diplomas within their degree program. So that if after the end of first year you decide, you know what, this isn't for me, okay, we can exit you with another qualification so that at least your debt wasn't for nothing. I think that has had some really good outcomes, both for completion. It doesn't support you for retention or attrition, right? Because they've still left, but at least they're completers. The other piece that I think is really important is really high quality advice about how students can have a more manageable study load. So in a previous life at La Trobe, and Mollie will remember, she was there with me at the time, giving students targeted advice that says, drop a subject or two. Here's how you can still complete if we're running through summer semester or other ways that you might be able to accelerate your degree in some times when it makes sense and slow down in others when you're having a little bit more pressure, actually made a really significant difference on the retention that we were seeing for cohorts. And I can speak here at Deakin, we are, like other institutions, seeing average study load drop, which I actually think is a really good thing. It helps people manage their life around their study in a more proactive way.
But on that, isn't it, statistically, part-time students and students with lower load tend to be the ones that drop out more? Obviously, I hear what you're saying in terms of make it easier for them and their life, but isn't the university taking on greater risk?
Yeah, we do. And look, we end up with a lower annual student revenue per student, which has a different set of challenges. But a student can successfully undertake 3 subjects and have a full-time study load, still be eligible for Centrelink benefits. And there's a sweet spot there, discouraging students from taking 5 subjects and overloading. Those students that are sitting at potentially 4 subjects who aren't engaging as actively in those subjects in the early weeks gives us an opportunity to reach out to them and say, hey, it looks like you're doing okay, but have you thought about reducing your load? Would that help? That proactive advising really makes a difference.
I think there's still a problem, though, with the part-time students.
Yeah.
So back in the 2010s, when I was at the Grattan Institute, we had the luxury of the department's unit record data for enrolment, and we looked at completions. And for people who are consistently part-time, that is, they never have a year of full-time study, the 8-year completion rate was below 30%. So that's really, really bad. And so I think people should know about that before they start, and at least try to spend some of their time at university at full-time or close to full-time to give themselves a realistic chance of finishing.
Tim Pitman, what's your thought on that? What's the data telling you?
I kind of want to take answer in two parts: a big picture and a small picture. To the earlier point about being a two-track system, I'd actually argue it's a multi-track system. The fact is, over the last few years, from most recent data is 2023, from 2016 to 2023, the sector as a whole has improved its retention rates, but that masks a great deal of variance. And when you start out disaggregated by regional remote students or First Nation students, etc., then you see the movement. So on that point, it's really important that we actually look at the trend over time. And what's important is to say, well, year on year, a university is improving. Because if you just take a single metric as a blunt instrument, or even a single metric for certain groups as a blunt instrument, it's not factoring in the realities and particular communities that universities exist within and the challenges, the strengths and the weaknesses that their students face. So it's important for the universities to be judged with trends over time. And on that, sorry, just a quick plug, but we have an interactive data tool. Anyone can go to our website, plug in any university, and they can look at that trend over time, and they can compare it to other universities or the state, etc. And they can also look at, we've got student experience data there, so they can tell you if there's a relationship between sense of belonging, etc. So that's the big picture. The more specific picture, I think it was touched on earlier, it's important that when universities think about retention, that they think about keeping them in the course and, to Stephen's point on debt, making them avoid debt. So, for instance, we recently conducted a randomized controlled trial looking at a particular initiative to engage with students early, that all the metrics were showing that they were disengaging from university studies, to see if this initiative, this program, would help them re-engage. And really broadly speaking, what it found was it didn't help the students re-engage with the studies. And I think there we can kind of do an allusion to Chris's earlier point about life load. Sometimes universities can't keep the student in the course because there are external factors. But what the initiative was doing was making them aware of that financial penalty. So to Stephen's point, the duty of care to get them out of the course before they incur significant debt. So yeah, let's look at how universities are tracking at the time and look at very specific universities in relation to their communities. And let's consider the dual moral imperative of encouraging the student in their studies, but first and foremost, not setting them up for failure.
Was COVID with everybody moving online, was that not a circuit breaker? Did that change the game?
It was a massive disruptor, and we're still kind of seeing how things are playing out after then, would be my core commentary.
Like in the short term, it actually improved retention. But then once the labour market took off in 22 and 23, a whole lot of these people left. So if you look at those year one attrition the department publishes, that was positive. Then if you look at the 4 years out data, that was negative. So they're moving in opposite directions. And I think was people stayed in 2020 and 2021 because they couldn't get a job. But as soon as there were jobs everywhere, we saw, late term dropping of courses, which is kind of the people who were close that Chris was talking about.
To Andrew's earlier point, the main effect that we've observed is that the movement of the majority, if not all, universities online in a somewhat of a panic, certainly an urgent fashion, created an environment where the requirements that UNE had been running for decades, that people came to campus for a period of their degree, we became completely uncompetitive. So people were saying from other universities, they were marketing it quite directly. You never have to come here, but if you'd like to, just jump on the bus. Whereas we had the 2-week intensives, and that was all planned around the college vacancies in the college and the timing of academic and quite a complex calendar. And people just signed out. They said, well, if I go to these other universities, I don't need to do the on-campus experience. Even if it might be enjoyable, it's very disruptive to my life. We've not seen the recovery on that. So we have now had to relax the requirements for people to come and do intensives which is not, our academics are not happy because they love those intensives and the people's experience in those intensives has been wonderful, but it became uncompetitive overnight for us with COVID, and there hasn't been any return on that, or any rebound, if you like.
Well, that's really interesting. Chris, how do you feel about compacts? Let's get on to the nitty-gritty, where we're facing an era of new compacts between ATEC and universities individually. One of the factors that's going to determine funding or access to additional load apparently appears to be retention. Given that your retention is wildly variable, as we've heard, among different cohorts, and different universities, for example, in the regions, have a very different student mix and a much lower rate of retention. How do you feel about that?
Well, as I said, I just walked out of an exec meeting where we had quite a conversation on, so we're about to find out. So ATEC has been blessed and it now goes to heaven for its final signing. We'll find out who the commissioners are, and there's a slight extension around the number of those people, which I think is a very good thing. What we don't know is where the teeth are. We've got this problem with compacts we've had all the way along, that what's the stick, what's the carrot, and where's this binding in? So for us, we would very much like to bind in conversations about who the people are that come to our university and have some component of our compact acknowledging who they are. We would like acknowledgement coming back to the lives of people. We have a strategy that says we should step far more into people's lives if they want that. And so instead of just providing structure around people in their course, providing structure around people in their lives and their aspirations for degrees. Now that's going to be complicated and difficult. So if our compact doesn't recognise that that's a valid place for us to be as a university, then we're being left high and dry with our communities, because our communities are very, very keen on this. We know that. So if the compact doesn't have teeth, then we get a bit left. Sorry, Stephen.
But you're onto this already. Your 10-year plan has got that big focus on building connection with region. And that in some ways is a great advantage. I mean, paradoxically, for a long time it wasn't, but now a great advantage in building your brand. It's an advantage that Deakin has got to an extent. With respect to him, I don't think, and Jessica, I don't think Curtin has, being a huge university in a built-up area. I don't know how loyalty and a sense of belonging to a community helps you with attrition, but it's got to be a positive.
Well, we think we can help people complete. We know who they are. Anyway, I don't want to take up the whole panel's day with our thinking around the working to learn program. So it's essentially a reversal of placements, where you assume that people are working, you assist in that, you provide a workplace, people have dignity of a job, but they're your learners and workers at the same time, in trying to get alignment between where they're trying to get to in their life with their degree and where they're working. At the moment, you could be pulling beers or you could be working anywhere on anything, and your aspiration is to become a professional in a different space. And we're essentially saying, well, what's our role in getting alignment there? We think it'll help a lot with attrition. But that's hypothesis. We think that if we care for people's lives and we participate and they're aligned, then why wouldn't they be more likely to complete? And one answer might be, well, they got in next to that profession and decided it wasn't really what they wanted to do. And I think that's a valid reason to try. Frankly, if people are trying something and think, oh, this is not what I thought it would, what I thought it would be, so I don't really want to do it, I think that's valid.
Can I go to Mollie Dollinger next? There's a question in the Q&A, and please put your questions through in the Q&A and we'll try and get through them. It says, thanks for your interesting discussion. How do you go about supporting the students? We've heard from Chris about supporting the UNE cohort. Can you tell us what's working?
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to talk today about and get the other panelists' thoughts on was very much the discussion, if you take a step back at sort of how the government and ATEC is positioning all of this, is really around penalizing universities. And the issue with that is that when you take that stick approach, universities act in ways that are not necessarily in the best interest of our individual students because the system has set us up for this. I mean, Graham Turner has written an entire book about how the university sector is responding this way in government interaction and so on. So I think where I'm thinking is how do we get this, all this talk about retention and ATEC and setting prices and courses and so on, to think more about a reward system and rewarding the universities who are doing the hard work, who are taking on the most complex students. At the moment, equity students needs-based funding has meant that we do get additional funding for equity students, but it's all one category, right? When we know in reality that part-time, carer, low SES, Indigenous, these things are intersectional. They require additional support. It's not just one size fits all. So I think there's a lot of nuance that is missing in the conversation. And universities like UNE, but also Curtin and Deakin and so on, who are taking on a greater percentage of equity students should also be rewarded for doing so. Because this does add complexity to the space, but of course it also adds huge amounts of reward in the diversity of our cohort and so on as well.
Is that a task for the compacts process?
I mean, I would love to see the compacts take that. At the moment, I think a cynic would look at the compacts and wonder, again, they don't have any teeth necessarily. What is the goal of this statement? Instead of making it, you say you're going to do this and you need to follow through. So that's sort of that penalty, concept is instead perhaps thinking about these are the areas we want to grow and excel in, and then reward them based on that.
I think you should apply to be a commissioner, Mollie. I think you're right on the right point there, and I also think that there's another hidden problem here that people don't like to say out loud, which is large universities using wealth to hoover up cohorts that the minister is looking to have in university, and then having those people falling out of those environments within a year or 2 years is going to create a group of people that will be disaffected, Stephen, to your point. Even though they might only have 1 or 2 years of HECS, they are not going to be happy about having that HECS and not receive the supportive environment for completions. And so there is another question, and the analogy is, people who pick up the supervision of PhD students where they lose their supervisor. We used to call these rescue supervisors, and we used to reward them heavily in our university for taking the care to go and help high degree research students get completed. So there's perhaps also a reward factor in there where universities haven't had sufficient support structure to lose these cohorts, and other universities pick them up and get them completed. There's another case for reward, I think.
And I think
Jessica, what's your thoughts?
Sorry, there's a few pieces in there. One, I agree completely. Let's move from reward rather than stick. There's a bigger question about, is retention or attrition the right measure? Can we be a bit more sophisticated in how we think about that to better represent the journeys of our students based on cohorts and other opportunities for them to dip in and out of education across the life cycle? But really, for me, when I think about retention, it's not just about the support that you put around the student. You've got to think completely differently about the way in which you are designing your educational environment. It's the pieces that Chris is talking about through your strategy. This has to include the way you design your curriculum, the way you offer that curriculum. It's not enough to just put things online to make it more flexible for students, but really, how are we stepping back and challenging our own assumptions within organisations about how we develop and design curriculum that is truly supportive of the kinds of learners we want to be able to support? I would hope that through the compact process, that gives our institution the flexibility to talk more about how we're thinking about educating part-time learners, mature learners, people who are across the country, and what that means in terms of cost. Not sure that will bear its way out. But for me, retention as our single point measure is not going to accurately reflect the complexity of this as a challenge, because they're real people and real lives. But I would hope that the compact process puts a layer of accountability back on in every institution in the sector, because I think for a very long time, and I've been in been talking about retention and transition for a very long time, there are institutions across the country who have not been delivering on the responsibility that we all have to make sure that the people who come to our universities have a positive experience and don't leave it feeling like a higher education is not for them. So I think picks up lots of points, but an important one.
I think that's really interesting. There's a couple more follow-on questions to that. Firstly, all the rhetoric that I have seen around retention and compacts has been more stick than carrot so far. And is there not an expectation that, we haven't got any extra money, so therefore we won't be paying more? You've already got needs-based funding and jobs done, wash the hands, and compacts will clamp down in a punitive way. So I presume that there is a concern in institutions about that. But secondly, you mentioned measurement. What is a better way? We've clearly, retention is a very blunt instrument that is in fact not telling us a lot. What would be better?
Tim, to your first point, I can't help myself. If you don't know that universities need more stick and punishment, you're just living under a rock.
Thank you.
Pick up on that. I think the whole conversation about stick and carrot is also a little bit, it's a bit simplistic. That if commission-based compacts do their job, which we all hope they'll do, it's not a question of immediately proceeding to it. It shouldn't be a question of immediately proceeding to a carrot and stick. You should be saying, okay, these are my students. These are the particular student markets that I want. These are the pools I want to swim in, and these are the students I want to support. And on evidence, these are the things that they need for support. So it's a proper contextualized conversation. So that's the first point. In simple terms, the university says, these are the students and this is how I'm going to support them. The next stage then is having a regular review and saying, okay, is that support actually working? And with respect to, I think, retention, when contextualized and nuanced, in other words, specific, and again, to my earlier comment, you're not looking at a hard number, you're saying, are we seeing improvements rather than declines? Is your strategy working? If it's not working, then ATEC comes in and asks the question, is it not working because you've got the wrong strategy? Or is it not working because you've got the right strategy and you're not following it? Now, at that point, there's a range of opportunities that can come up. It could be increased regulatory oversight by ATEC. It could be more tight funding. In other words, not taking away money or adding more money, but saying the money we're giving you, we're going to tie it to very specific things to address this problem. You're not even at carrot and stick yet, where there are meaningful changes that the ATEC can get into an honest conversation with each university and say, are you proceeding from the basis of evidence? And are you doing the things that you've identified will make a difference to your students? I think that's a role that the mission-based compacts will really play a positive part.
But any incentive model will be gained.
I think, yeah, I've been a policy researcher for 30 years. Everything can be gained. Everything will be gained around the edges without a doubt. But if you get the core of it correct, and if you stick to certain fundamental principles again, the thing I want to really pick up on here is that I, like a lot of people personally, believe that the retention that's important is what we call in-system retention. In other words, universities and the government do publish data on this, that the retention that matters is the student who stays in the higher education system. So if a university, if the student starts at University A and then the following year goes to University B, University A is not punishable. So, and I think those kind of core metrics are very, very important.
Tim, there's a question in here which I'll just throw to you before we go to others. Do ideas on alternative metrics for retention? Should there be space for a qualitative narrative in compacts?
I think that I'm obviously viewing this through the lens of evaluation, it's in the source on the bottle, so to speak. Yeah, the qualitative is important because basically a good evaluation will address two things. Will address the what and the why. So, for instance, a randomized control trial, for example, is very good in certain situations at identifying the what. Did the numbers go up, did the numbers go down? But if it's just a pure numerical activity, it doesn't necessarily tell you why that occurred. That's where other approaches to evaluation with qualitative discussions can marry the two together. So you have some hard numbers to work out what's shifting and what's not shifting. And then you have the more in-depth discussions, the fault, if you will, to actually look under the hood and say, now we can see why that is.
Andrew, what's your thoughts on compacts? Obviously, this is really critical for the sector going forward. It's the funding for and the requirements in response for from a domestic point of view for institutions? Are they going to work? And what are we looking for? Will retention be a key part of it? What's your thoughts?
I think the problem with the compacts as they stand from my perspective is the government could put almost anything in them. And so I'm concerned that this gives them far too much, essentially unregulated power over the sector. And so you could get, completely unreasonable demands around retention that are simply not realistic given the nature of your students, and then achieve a penalty as a result of not meeting that, even though these goals never had any empirical basis. So it's going to be really important to see that if they do set precise targets, they explain the analysis behind that. For example, showing that, other universities with similar student profiles have achieved better retention. Why haven't you? And then sort of going to Tim's point, digging into the reasons why, rather than simply handing out a penalty, which may just compound the university's problems. They've got the same problems, but less money to deal with them.
Geez, Andrew, they could get Deloitte to do the methodology.
Indeed. Add to the $1.8 billion.
Tim, I don't know
Mollie,
whether it's just semantics, but I wonder whether the word retention. There's two words here that are a bit problematic. One is retention is not physiologically not generally considered a good thing, and then there's this other word, attrition, and like no one outside the sector has any idea what on earth we're talking about. And one might wonder whether that feels like the university's trying to hold on, and then get that Deloitte link, we might call it, as a euphemism for the rest of the discussion, where it's about the money associated with keeping the student in the system rather than losing them and losing the money. We might wonder whether progression is perhaps another way of thinking about it. Is that, what's the distribution of progression in an institution over time looking like, and could a shift in that distribution indicate that an institution is making sure, or working its hardest to make sure, that people are moving through again towards their aspiration, and you can see a sense of progression? Now it'd have to be a bit nuanced. You'd have to be looking at cohorts, and because it'd be heavily gamed, to Stephen's point, if you're not careful on a distribution. But it feels to me something like that is meaningful. And I know this is going to sound really sloppy, because I am a bit sloppy, but I think the people who regulate us and are in charge of us should come to graduations, and I think they should go and listen to people's stories. The people who complete and the journeys they've had to completion. And okay, they can go and listen to school leavers, that's fine. There's plenty of stories. Mum and Dad paid for my college, I had a great time and finished. But these other people who are coming with their daughters and their uncles and their aunties and their sons and their mothers that have been shepherded through, little kids screaming at graduation. They've never known their parent, usually their mother, other than studying, and here she is completing. Like, people need to get a sense of the reality of the human side of completion, I think, to get that feeling of why progression is so important, why people don't leave, is because of that sense of progress. As I say, it's a bit sloppy, but I just somehow need to get that sense of completion, that sense of conclusion of an incredible life experience for people, and get it in a bottle somehow and send it to Canberra.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful point. It is so much of this is the people element tends to be lost with the terminology. Is there enough money in the system to fund effective education for particularly the learners that the Accord wants to bring in? We have a national vision based on 1 million people who are relatively underprepared for higher education to come in and start learning across the tertiary sector. Is there enough money in needs-based funding? How is this going to actually work?
I mean, I'll Tim, address your question, but sort of build off of what Chris was talking about as well. I love progression. I love the idea, and I hope that this is perhaps where ATEC is going, to think about the system more broadly, to think about linking up our data around VET and obviously the free TAFE program, but also moving into perhaps microcreds and short form learning. I don't think students are going to stay the same. I mean, we know that they're going to keep changing. Our sector has to stop being responsive to things and instead start leading the way. We need diversified offerings that fit for people's and their life load has been discussed. But if we're going to diversify and perhaps add additional revenue streams, those should be rigorous and they should be accountable, and we should make sure that they are respected and valued across the society so that they do become routes that people can take and upskill and professional education and so on. So I think that's a really important part of this that's kind of missing at the moment.
But that's so important, Mollie, because you've got you have got a product, a course suite of courses designed for elite students that basically haven't changed for 100 years plus, and yet you now want to have the system's massified, and it will get even more massified over the next 5 years. Is it time to start thinking in terms of what you actually offer students, not necessarily in terms of support or in terms of teaching strategies, but in terms of what the products actually are? Fee-free TAFE appears, we haven't seen the attrition numbers yet, but fee-free TAFE seems to have reached an enormous market. Whether there are higher education equivalents.
We just had Stephen, a declaration from the minister and others on the numbers of completions of TAFE and fee-free TAFE without any reference at all to the numbers who enrolled.
Yeah.
So they're absolutely looking at success and look at all these people completing TAFE. The attrition, it's not so much attrition. Our experience in that sector is that it's the zombie students. They're just not there. They're not responsive, but there's a large number of them. So that's not being looked at. It's so who's completing in the fee-free TAFE. We've seen that.
Well, the 4 years are about to come up, so they're going to have that. They won't be able to keep hiding those numbers. Does that make sense, Andrew Norton?
Yeah, I think the problem here is the way we cost the system. So to date, we've entirely used descriptive costing methods. So this is what the average cost is, rather than using some normative standard. This is what we should be doing, and this is what it costs. This sort of goes to Mollie's point that, we need to work out what it costs for different cohorts. We've sort of nominated a number via needs-based funding, but it's got no science to it. I think that's what we genuinely need if we're going to have a system that's actually fit for the students we have. We're probably already we have via needs-based funding, effectively the G8's getting less per student, which is probably logical because on average their students need less help. But whether this needs-based funding is the right number, to me it looks like it's been reverse engineered to fit within a funding envelope. And so it isn't really saying this is what we need to do.
Jessica, there's been a couple of questions come through which I think tie back perhaps to your earlier discussion about nested qualifications. This one says, looking at some of the innovations coming out of the US, there's a lot of recognition of prior learning for work experience and so on. The minister has talked about why not do a year at TAFE and then go into second year. There's a lot happening in this space, and what's your thoughts? Where are we going in terms of cutting up courses differently or doing more of the same?
And I think it builds off the point that Mollie made around short form learning, micro-credentials. We've been talking about this across the sector for a really long time. I think 3-year degrees, sure, they might be around for the foreseeable future. Does the products of education that we currently offer serve the needs that are going to help us to deliver on the chord, or what future professionals are going to need to upskill and reskill across their lives? I would argue not. The broader question is, how do you start to then make those learning opportunities more accessible for wider cohorts? Because at the moment, those are either short courses or other types of credentials that people have to pay upfront for. We don't necessarily get government funding for those, although there has been some attempt to do that with shorter form learning in the past. I think that stepping back, and I hope the ATEC will do this, stepping back and think about what are the contemporary needs of our society and how do we create a funding system that allows us to meet the needs of our population And also, to pick up some of the earlier point, recognize that for us to be successful, we need to have institutions across the country and institutions that are deeply embedded in their communities. And that means the funding model for our regional universities is not necessarily as supportive as it should be. So I think there's a needs-based funding issue to that. But then there's also a how do we make sure that across the country universities aren't in a position where they're no longer their financial situation is such that they're not able to support the students that they really need to. Different question.
And just to follow up, following on from that, another question, where does industry fit into this equation? We keep hearing of fewer graduate jobs, disruption of AI. How are we going to better integrate with industry to produce these new qualifications that people want and there are jobs at the end?
Yeah, there's a question of the degree apprenticeships model. You see that happening across multiple institutions here in the country. We're not really set up for that. If you look at what the learnings are from the UK, you could never bring that. You could never bring that here. You probably don't want to. There's different flaws within that model. But how are we incentivizing industry? And then it calls into question, though, how are we structuring our degrees that mean that we're not necessarily thinking about subject to subject structures that build across a degree, but actually thinking about how do we put people in industry and then be more flexible in the way that we design our curriculum so that people can genuinely study and learn in a way that supports the industry partner to be able to meet their own workforce needs.
They're quite hard-nosed in many cases as well, in that, well, I can't be certain that person is going to continue to work for me. And I think, well, there's a limit to the university's responsibility for the way you treat your people. But we are starting now to edge up on this really interesting conversation about knowledge and skills. In general, I think most businesses, particularly small businesses, are looking for a skill uplift. And whether a university isn't the right place is an interesting question, and also the succession of skills. But this is juxtaposed at the moment with conversations from employers that we're looking for people who know how to solve problems. We're looking for people who know how to design things. We're looking for people with creativity, which is sitting next to, I think, the beginning of the realization of a fear that there's now a machine that can produce a lot of what looks like skills in the sense of immediate information or knowledge access. And there's a sweet spot in there for us. We're definitely seeking that sweet spot by embracing the technology. How does artificial intelligence augment the academics so that the in-place experience can be more bespoke? I think we're very, very close to that. I know that's a word that got overused and got burned a little, but it is becoming a reality, I feel. And the key one for me in there is what is the relationship between the learner in there and the academic? So how does the academic time get allocated into the human interaction in a much more effective manner? So we're looking very closely how much burden from the academics as we possibly can in terms of bureaucracy. And again, this is a tool that can certainly help there. Not everyone's deeply embracing of that, but they all hate the other stuff. Now, as we relieve that time, our priority is to say, well, how much direct interaction between humans, the academics and the learners in our system? And if they're in place in companies and they can get that direct interaction, and it's well informed by the previous interaction between the learner and the AI, then there's a lot more joy in there, I think, for both the learners and academics. And I think if that experience is expressed within the companies reasonably quickly in the development of the people, I think we'll see more companies begin to mobilize. I think they lose track of what people are learning or not learning, or whether they're getting a degree or not, and whether it actually hit the spot for what the company might have been looking for. And I am talking mostly about small companies. In general, larger companies actually are more philanthropic about education in general.
On AI,
Tim,
sorry.
you go. Oh, look, Tim Pitman. Sorry, Stephen. Tim Pitman, I wanted to, we've been talking a lot about universities. There's a lot of discussion about VET likewise. Should we have a common measure of progression as opposed to retention? If we're talking about a harmonised system, but with two different ministers, two different funding systems, two different regulators, and yet we're supposed to have a general sense of understanding about retention and progression. Call it what you will. Where are we going to go with this to fix it?
Referring to my earlier comments, I think harmonizing in the sense of a single metric or a single number. Harmonizing in the sense of all moving towards a path of equal effort, everyone within their context lifting their game and moving, yes. Just another way of looking at it, consider the government's made a significant investment in free uni prep courses, what we call enabling programs. Retention within enabling programs has been traditionally quite high. Sorry, attrition within enabling programs, attrition being quite high. And that is for many seen as an actual feature, a design feature of it, because it's a free opportunity to see if university is right for you and the skills are right for you. And so that's an example where a retention rate that works within a pre-university program is not necessarily the same as a retention rate we're seeking in subsequent undergraduate studies. The same, I think, applies when you start moving to dual sector, different vet qualifications. What's the person in there for? What's the nature of the degree? So harmonisation in terms of, yes, we all should be moving towards improving gains overall, yes, but beyond that, no.
Tim, we find those who get through the uni ready, who complete the uni ready, their retention rate through the degree is really high.
So we're just about to, we're shortly going to be releasing a report across the whole sector. And it's basically a kind of case of the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's really a mixed picture. Some universities, as you say, and we'll put this out in our data, some universities, the retention rates are the same as Year 12 leaders. Sometimes they're actually above. For other universities, they're significantly lower. And I think this gets, again, to the earlier point. For starters, I'm not aware of any universal definition of an enabling program and what constitutes an enabling program. So I think we're finding that that term is being used for a range of products out there. But again, it gets that thing. An enabling program is a critical alternative pathway to university if used correctly and within the context of the university using it. But like a lot of support mechanisms for students, if they're just lifted from another environment and another context and just dumped down and kind of like wound up and spun and let go, then you're going to run into problems. Universities have to embed them into their overall plan for students.
Tim, can I ask Mollie a question?
Yes.
Mollie, if Mollie's happy to answer it. I wonder whether sometimes life is in fact also a metaphor for sheer bewilderment of people who just arrive in that first 6 months and really do not know what is going on and are scared and alienated from the whole experience. I wonder if there's a role there, very, very, very customized role, institution specific, course specific for AI, just to provide the level of intensive support's probably the wrong word, but the level of intensive information and direction that no university is ever going to have enough people to provide.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is potential in that. I was reflecting earlier on the conversation about how we were talking about industry, and I guess it's a little bit on brand for me to bring this up. But I think how we talk about partnership, so whether we're talking about partnership with industry or partnership with government or partnership with vet or partnership with students, is again a term that's thrown around a lot and used quite unscientifically. I think feels this way as well, but that's why it's so important that we actively embed student voice into our processes all the time, because it is always going to be different. The same students that graduated 3 years ago are not the students we have now. And so when it comes to AI, it's exactly the same. I mean, right now we're dealing with students who are learning to use AI just like us. It's kind of, quite nice in a way. That will not be the case in another couple years, right? So a lot of the students who have, told us about their views on AI, it might look entirely different in another couple years. So I think there's lots of potential there, but I think we need to think structurally and how universities are going to stay ahead of the curve when it comes to these changing demographics.
I think what AI can do, though, is, and I agree with you completely, Mollie, I think where AI can be great value for us is reducing the barrier for a student asking for help. There are a number of students who just don't want to ask a real person. And so if we can lower that barrier, we can use technology to give good directional advice to students at the point in time that they need it, and also reduce that barrier to access, but then make sure that that is being used as only one piece of a much more sophisticated approach, where you then have targeted human intervention and appropriate triage. That means a student doesn't have to tell and retell their story, but that we take what we know about the student and support them in a positive and proactive way. I think that's when you're going to start to see us really leveraging the power of that technology as an opportunity to support retention. And there's already institutions that are using bots, particularly in the States, that are helping as the guide on the side kind of tutor, that are helping students to feel like they're that sense of belonging. Like, I don't know how I particularly feel about that, but even having that interaction could be supportive of a student's sense of belonging. But I think there's making sure that there is still that human connection in there. I think that will be the critical piece for us.
Can I jump in here? Because what we've heard is there are a range of different methods to improve retention there, but there's also a range of different levels of effectiveness, shall we say politely, in terms of rolling out programs to support retention. Andrew Norton, you imagine you are Chief Commissioner of ATEC as of tomorrow.
Terrifying, Chris, mate.
That's mean.
Yes, I know. But imagine you are. How do you confront it from the ATEC point of view? Like, if you're sitting there thinking, well, they've done well, they haven't, how are we going to tell?
I think if I was ATEC Chief Commissioner, I would be much more cautious than I think the real Chief Commissioner is going to be. I would pay far more attention to what people on the ground are saying is realistic and what is not. And someone made a point earlier about the qualitative element to this. I think I would also use all the data that's collected but not actually effectively analysed. Do proper statistical analysis to see, is University of New England, is it performing similarly to another university that has many online students? And only if this shows there's a problem, do I, take the assumption that probably something is going wrong and approach the Vice Chancellor.
But then, Andrew, as you've pointed out before, data is often, 1-2 years late when it's coming out of the department. How are they going to actually judge any of this in a timely fashion anyway, year on year?
Well, we probably can do things more quickly than we do. Like, the department sort of insists on absolutely final data, which appears, 18 months after they first enroll. But we can, in theory, use real-time data. If people are disappearing by the census date, we know that by the end of March. We can use these lead indicators that things might be going wrong.
Chris, if you're, I'm assuming you're not jumping ship to join ATEC, but are you nervous about trying to form a compact in the remaining 8 months, I think, that we have before they're supposed to be up and running?
No, I don't think nervous would be the right. I think we're eager, Tim, to get into the conversation. I hear the subtext to what Andrew has said, and I think he's right on the money. It will depend a lot on the personalities of and the style of people they bring in to the commission. It'll depend a lot on the way the commissioners form a team. It's only 5 minutes ago that we got 2 more. And so whatever mental models people have been carrying of the way this thing will work have just been quite disrupted in the sense of, well, what will be those other skills and what will be the experiences? One would imagine that the dual sector, the space for dual sector is going to get augmented in that conversation. So no, I don't think we're nervous. Probably nervous a bit of time burn that, how's it going to go forward? But we put our hand up to be a trial university in a flash. We really think that the things that go on in this university the cohorts of people we're talking about. We think this is going to become a general issue for the sector when we start to move towards 1 million students. We're going to get even more deeply into these cohorts of people that UNE is working with, not just UNE, but this is our norm rather than our margin, which is the reverse of the majority of university, where the cohorts of people that we're talking about are in the margin of the university, not in the main body. So from our perspective, we'd like to be heard. We'd like to articulate what we think, where we think focus needs to be. And back to that terrible question you asked before, is there enough money in the system to deal with these people? We're not even close, Tim. So are we going to create a new international student rush in some other dimension for universities to find the revenue to do the supporting? That's in our strategy. We think we have to be responsible for that. We don't think the government is going to come with revenue that supports it. One thing that we'd like to suggest in a compact to go into some other universities is that they increase the price of their degrees in relation to their international ranking. And so they'd love that. They will get more money because they can charge the students more money in the student contribution, but a leveling of the field of how much people regard the logo against the satisfaction or experience in those universities. I'd love to see that embedded in some of the other compacts. I wouldn't mind having a seat in the writing of compacts of some other universities, but maybe you didn't ask me that.
Jessica, any closing thoughts on compacts, where to from here, and how we better understand this retention issue across the country?
I think the question about how we understand it is the critical one. How are we thinking about a more sophisticated measure rather than a blunt instrument of retention is the piece for me. And then how do you weave that through the more authentic, compact approach?
That's great. Awesome. Tim Pitman, if you had one thing with a magic wand to improve the sector's performance in progression/retention, what would it be?
Just evaluation. Look, I mean, I think evaluation is the ugly duckling of universities. Universities love research. They love new, shiny stuff. Evaluation is a bit of a drudge sometimes, but this kind of ties up a lot of earlier points. Sometimes you have to look for the new and the innovative, the AI, the accepting that your student population is different, that they have different needs. Sometimes the solution is actually out there and it's always worked. You're just not implementing it properly, and you won't know unless you evaluate. And evaluation, like I say, is drudgy and boring, but it's critical to student success. And it's a place that the government, through ATEC, through the mission-based complex, could really make a difference. And I wasn't joking.
Mollie, last but not least, can you give us your closing thoughts? Retention, where to from here?
I think rethink the policy is improved. I don't think it's there yet. We need to weigh the measure of student complexity. We need to consider bans. And then when it comes to practice, I think there is a lot of good knowledge out there. And so we need to reward those that are innovative.
Concise and erudite. Thank you so much to Mollie Dollinger, Andrew Norton, Chris Moran, Tim Pitman, and Jessica Vanderlelie, and of course my colleague Stephen Matchett. We are over and out.